Hey there, listeners. We have some cool news to deliver. We have over 6,000 downloads of this podcast, over 1,000 of which have been in the last month alone, which is drastically more than we've had in the past. That makes this next part very funny. We have just 2 reviews. So, this is just a reminder. I'm trying to give you free National Land Realty swag. Submit a review of this podcast to Apple Podcasts or at nationalland.podbean.com, which is our podcast homepage. And remember, good, bad, or in between, we'll be reading these reviews on the next podcast and picking our favorites as we move along. But hopefully that's more than 2. And we have one to read from Sheepdog Fishing about our episode on the importance of relationships with Micah Erling. Excellent interview. Micah is very personable and a solid individual from Sheepdog Fishing. Thank you for your review. Now, the rest of you, get it in gear. Throw some reviews down. We'll be drawing our favorite reviews in March of 2023 and give you free things. Everybody likes free things, so get those reviews in. Welcome to episode number 32 of the National Land Realty Podcast, where we discuss all things land. Our goal here is to inform, educate, and entertain those of you who own land or are interested in the buying and selling of land throughout the United States. My name is Mac Christian, and I am the Chief Marketing Officer here at National Land Realty. I'll be your host for this episode. In this episode, I'm talking with estate planning specialist Justin Plummer from the law offices of Cheryl and David in Greensboro, North Carolina. Justin has multiple degrees in pre-law and psychology from Appalachian State University, as well as a Juris Doctorate from the Appalachian School of Law in Virginia. Justin started his career in real estate law and now works exclusively with estate planning, which, of course, encompasses real estate, as you will hear. Land is something that we don't just own. It becomes part of your soul. Justin has dedicated his life to making sure that his clients are able to hand down the things that they love to the people that they love. And that includes their land. Now sit back and enjoy. I am sitting here with Justin Plummer out of Greensboro, North Carolina. He is an estate planning specialist. And just so the listeners know, I have gotten his intro wrong like 3 times in a row now because I thought he was in another place. And he's been a great sport with me to sit you through this. But Justin, just tell me a little bit about how you got to where you are, what got you interested in estate planning, and sort of what you do now in your practice.
Absolutely, Matt. Well, I appreciate you having me on. Yeah, I have lived all over North Carolina and a little bit in Virginia, so it's hard for me to keep it straight where I am. So no worries on that end. Yeah, I actually attended Appalachian State University many years ago, seemingly as I look in the mirror every day, more further and further away, and then went to the Appalachian School of Law after taking a year off and kind of clerking for a local firm in Concord, Charlotte, North Carolina area. Went up to Virginia, small school in Virginia, where basically there's not a whole lot to do except for study and fly fish, which was really good for my end. After that, took the bar exam in North Carolina. I got licensed there. I'm now licensed in North Carolina and Virginia. I don't use my license in Virginia as much, but right after I got out of law school, worked in the real estate foreclosure sector, and then kind of went to the residential commercial real estate market in Charlotte with another firm, and then kind of started doing a little bit more estate planning, and then kind of flip-flopped that and wanted to transition to doing estate planning full time. So I always tell people, as I told Mac earlier, I'm a recovering dirt attorney for everybody listening out there. Just one of those things I made a choice on a couple years ago. But in my field of estate planning, it's you don't get too far away from it because you have to deal with it every day. So still doing title searches a good bit, and still doing dealing with planning for, say, family farms or, inherited land or, just different commercial properties, what have you, apartment complexes, whatever. As people pass away, obviously those things have to go somewhere. So we have to plan for those things. But I actually got into the field. It's kind of a solemn, solemn story, but I think it still rings true. I tell this story quite a bit, so it's not as hurtful as it used to be. But right after law school, unfortunately, my father passed away quite suddenly, and being the only child in the family and kind of being the only smart kid, I like to think of myself that way as an only child, but I had to handle his estate and just saw kind of, even with the law degree at that point in time, not really practicing yet, how hard and difficult that was. And just to kind of what we'll talk about today, and I guess what maybe some of your listeners are really interested in, is that we actually had some investment land that we had to deal with. We had had some land in and around the greater Charlotte area that we'd had under contract in 2007, 2008. And then I think something happened in the world where the funding and everything kind of fell through. Something with the economic factors back then. I can't really remember.
There was some kind of event that happened.
There's some kind of event there that happened. But anyways, we've still been trying to develop that land, and obviously that contract fell through. But throughout that process, after my dad passed away, we were still trying to sell it. So we had to go through a full probate proceeding and kind of go through the rigmarole of all of that to handle it. So I always tell people, when these types of things happen, or if somebody's trying to sell property through an estate or after a loved one's passed away, I've been through that. And it's obviously on top of a grieving time period or whatever else, it's just, kind of added insult to injury. So it's important to try to, and plan for things as much as you can. Obviously, my joke, and many jokes from estate planning, if you want to call it a joke, is that if we had a crystal ball, our lives would be a lot easier. But unfortunately, we don't know how the cookies are going to crumble most of the time in the estate planning world. But no, that's really how I got into the estate planning world. And, my specialty at our office is really kind of, after putting a plan together, is helping families kind of take it apart. And so that's, I get to see both sides of it. And that really helps me kind of try to find the best fit for people and what they're looking for, trying to plan for the future. So.
Yeah. And that's a pretty, it's always powerful when you've been through it yourself, knowing exactly what the experience is. Cause a lot of people are just explaining it. And, a lot of people like yourself that end up in a situation where you're working with it, a lot of, like you said, it was pretty early on to where, that stuff happens and maybe things aren't set up to where a couple of years down the road, you might've been able to set those up. But so now you've been through it now. So.
Yeah, and I really, living that and seeing my parents live through that is one of those things where, you wish you could have kind of, hindsight's 2020 and gone back and done some things better. But I try to take that in my back pocket and kind of keep those stories to tell them to people that, I can't remember the quote offhand, but it's the Ben Franklin quote about the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Mentality. It's maybe that was Shakespeare. Anyways, but I try to take that, and it's a little bit of planning up front will go a long way in the end. But I think it's something I see quite often when people pass away is maybe you're under contract already with an agent, or maybe you're already mom or dad or whoever it was were already trying to develop land, or maybe they had no idea that, say, Amazon was going to move down the street, and all of a sudden your property is worth a lot more than it used to be, right? And changing times, especially especially here in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic, it's we have a lot more influx of people coming in from other states and moving here for either retirement or tax purposes or stuff of that nature. So you see a changing dynamic with that development locally and just, I guess, regionally and really across the United States. I'm sure you guys see that quite a bit, just all over the place, just depending on what pocket you're in.
Correct. Yeah. And it's, I think just the conversation of estate planning and, focused around land is great, but just estate planning in general too is just so useful for people. Like, I've been through a very similar situation to your own. But in my particular situation was contested wills at the time, because the will can be contested by other parts of the family. And I was a minor at the time, standing to inherit my dad's things, and got it contested. And so like those things happen. Even though you think you have a setup, you might not. So there's different little things in there that I'm absolutely stoked to get into. So I wanted to take you back to a kind of a 101 level and walk us through sort of what probate is, because we're talking about a situation where there's not a will, there's not anything else, and basically the state steps in to manage what you inherit. So like, you've lost a loved one and now you're paying the state to figure it out, is essentially what happens, right?
Yeah. I mean, and I'll say this because, being an attorney, I always have to give my advisories. So, wherever you're listening, I'm licensed in Virginia, North Carolina. So every state's a little bit different, but I feel like a lot of states have pretty much a similar pathway or a similar generic kind of sense of everything. So what I'd say is this, from the forest for the trees approach, when somebody passes away, what really is going to control what happens is how things are titled. Right. So when we're talking about assets, we're talking about things like anything from, say, your couch, TVs to vehicles, land, houses, bank accounts, investments, those types of things. And really how those things are titled, whether or not they have, say, beneficiary designations on them, or say joint owners, maybe between spouses. However those things are titled, well, it really depends on, well, is this going to be going through court? Is this going to stay out of court, or what's the next step there? And, I hate to hear your story about that with contested stuff, but obviously, when you have minor children or, other people that are inheriting that are, say, maybe special needs or stuff like that, you always take into considerations. Yeah, we have to transfer those assets, but who they're being transferred to is just as important. And how, obviously, if you're a minor, you can't own things until you're at least 18, right? And even then, maybe that's not a good idea to own them at that point in time. I always tell people, even though you're 18, even if you have a good head on your shoulders, doesn't mean that you're not going to have friends who will help you spend those things, right? But, kind of, again, the forest for the trees mentality is, whether you have a will or you don't have a will, most of the time, if you don't have a will or a trust or, any kind of estate planning documents, I tell people, just from a general point of view, I always tell my clients, those are the times for you to actually have a voice for what you want to have happen, right? Because as you might imagine, if you don't have an estate planning document, have no fear, your state probably has a plan for you, and that might not be the best plan, right? I always tell people, like in North Carolina, for instance, I had a client a couple years ago who unfortunately passed away quite young. He was in his early 40s, had just gotten married, had some property that he owned before he got married, and had to tell his spouse that unfortunately, with the way they had things set up and him not having a will or trust or anything of that nature, that she just became a co-owner of that house with her mother-in-law. So you can imagine those things are probably not the easiest things to do. As you said in your situation, I know it wasn't to the point, but I've had people that pass away and all of a sudden you have minors who are involved. And obviously, if there's real estate involved, maybe that real estate then needs to be sold to generate money for the well-being of that child, for school, health, maintenance, stuff of that nature. So it really matters. And again, I always, I can't get people usually to plan before they're of age 50 or 60, because I feel like everybody feels like they're Superman or Superwoman, right? But unfortunately, there's always going to be that one night that comes for us no matter what, right? So it's important to have a plan, because that's your chance to speak up and have the action items you want to have happen. So taking that forward, when you have a will, or if you don't, most of the time I tell people, if you have a will, that's great. That gives people who's in charge and who's going to be getting what. Those are two of the biggest things, obviously, that get litigated or, that are important. But, it's still going to be at the mercy of the court. Now, certain states have different kind of levels of, if there's values over this amount, then it's a longer probate proceeding or a more involved. But, generically speaking, the probate proceeding is not the most fun thing in the world. And times we're doing planning to try to get around that for as much as we can, just because it's much like going to see a CPA or something for your taxes every year. There's a better way to do it, and there's different tax breaks and stuff like that you can get. So if there's a way to get around probate, we obviously want to do that, because probate is really the transference of the assets through the court, and the court makes sure that those things are done. Hopefully some of your listeners are sports individuals. I certainly am a huge sports nut, so I always try to explain things in terms of sports. So oftentimes I tell people, your will is your game plan, right? Whoever you have picked out as your executor or personal representative, whoever's going to step in your shoes when you pass away to kind of handle your final business, whether that be paying your last debts, filing your taxes, making sure that bank accounts are closed, what have you, getting everything to that next generation. You need to have that in place, right? They're going to be your coach. They're going to implement your game plan. But when you have to go through the probate proceeding, the court is going to act as your referee. And unfortunately, sometimes that's a really expensive referee to make sure that those things are done. Trust me, I'm not here to knock the court. I think they do a great job with, making sure that people aren't saying, having their hands in the cookie jar themselves, or making sure that nobody's, embezzling things or trying to hide things from certain beneficiaries and stuff. But it is an expensive and kind of arduous task because, for instance, most times in North Carolina, at least, a probate proceeding takes about a year to a year and a half. Certainly at the heights of COVID and stuff, with long wait times in different institutions, courts and stuff, we were seeing almost up to 2 years. I mean, you couldn't get anything.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it would last that long.
Yeah. And I mean, it depends on kind of what you have and what it looks like for you. Oftentimes it's not something that's involved every day, but, for instance, when you open up an estate proceeding, you're going to have to basically figure out, is that person going to be bonded, right? So there's a cost there for the insurance company. There's, North Carolina, it's $120 to file, to even open the estate up. In North Carolina, you have $4 on every 1,000 that goes through court. That's assessed as a probate fee. You have a notice to creditors. That's a column in the newspaper that basically alerts the world that this person's passed away. And if you have any debts that they need to pay, that's certainly, a cost there. People always tell me, why is it so much? I'm like, well, that's how national newspapers and local newspapers are kind of staying in business a lot of times, is legal notices now. But, it's not a huge out-of-pocket expense, but you can kind of see the snowball effect of, well, it's a little bit here, it's a little bit there. And this is even without having an attorney kind of help you through the process. Fortunately or unfortunately, it is one of those areas, at least in North Carolina, that you don't absolutely need an attorney, but I would tell you practically, you absolutely do, just because a lot of times, as you can tell, there's a lot of work on top of if you're still working or life events or anything else. And again, it's on top of a grieving time period. So after all that's kind of done, one of the things that's probably, if you're interested in the land aspect of it, is that, people inherit things at the value of the person who has passed away as of that date that they passed away, which is very important for tax purposes. It's something called a step up in cost basis. What that means is that if the house was worth $100,000 when your mother or father passed away, that's what you'll be inheriting at. You go to sell it later, that'll be what your capital gains are assessed of. So it's good in the sense that if your grandmother or grandfather had a house or something, or a farm or something they bought in 1900, well, that's probably going to be worth a lot more today, right? Especially if you're looking at it for development purposes or anything else down the road. But once that everything is valued, obviously you have to pay any final debts of a person who's passed away. And then finally you get to the final tax returns or anything of those items that need to be paid, and transferring finally all the assets over to whoever the person has left them to, whether it be children or loved ones, neighbors, whoever, charity. And then you're basically done once the court kind of stamps your accountings. But that's just a very generic way to tell you that, obviously that's something you want to avoid if you can possibly do that. So
I was going to say, it's I want to associate it with sort of like a small town mindset, but I grew up in a very, very small town in the Northwest, and just myself, anybody I grew up around, like the reaction you kind of go through with in life is like, I want to keep the state out of my stuff as much as possible, or any kind of agency stuff. But I was going to say it was a small town mindset just because, it's very strong in those areas, but I don't think that it is, because I think everybody wants to keep, any legislative body or any legal body out of making a decision for them on how they hand things down. So I guess, one of the best questions I can ask you is, if you've got land in your family, and that's what we work with, and that's kind of sort of the topic at hand. But how do you do that? Like, what's your pathways to do that? Because there's a few different pathways, right? You can go wills, you can go trusts, you can go, those kind of things. And what do you do? What do you do to protect what you've left behind for your loved ones?
Well, and that's a great question. What I'd say is wherever you're listening at, I highly recommend your first stop is probably, without me telling you, I know it's going to be the internet. Be wary. I always tell people one of my favorite buddies who shall remain nameless in town always has a coffee cup that says, "Please don't confuse my law degree with your Google search." I always tell people, you only get half the story for a lot of things, as you might imagine, on the internet. And I won't regale you with hours of stories I have by people who have tried to do their own documents and stuff of that nature. Certainly that's an option for you, but that's hazards waiting to happen. What I would say is this, depending on, again, what state you're in, your next stop after you do your own research is probably talk to somebody who does specifically estate planning in your area. A lot of people in the world do a lot of different things, especially local to North Carolina, and kind of giving some props to, Mayberry, if you will. Everybody kind of has that mindset of the old country or county attorney that kind of does a little bit of everything, right? They do mom or dad's will. They also did your real estate closing. They do your traffic tickets, what have you. It's a dangerous world being a general practitioner. So nothing against anybody who does that, but this is an area that you want to get somebody that does strictly this, because they will be able to tell you better ways than probably somebody that just does it generally. To your state as well. For instance, in Virginia, there's different types of deeds I can do in Virginia than are allowed in North Carolina. We can structure them in different ways, just depending on what people's goals are. But for instance, in Virginia, you can do something called a transfer on death beneficiary deed, right? So that a lot of times can get around the probate process there. In North Carolina, for instance, we don't have that option. So it just goes to show you that, just a step over the state line really matters with how you can function things. I'm not licensed in South Carolina, but a lot of my friends are, as you might imagine, living this close. And for instance, in South Carolina, just with the way a lot of their laws are set up, is that especially if you're a married couple, you have to ensure that your deed is either joint with rights of survivorship, or say something called tenancy by the entirety, which means you're married, right? Which is one of those things I don't believe they honor in South Carolina as far as a designation for their deeds. So it just goes to show you that, it really matters where you are at and where the land is located. Going back to probate for 1 second, this is important for probably a lot of your listeners. They don't realize this, is that if you have timeshares in other states, if you have a vacation home in another state, or even inherited land in another state, it's important for you to take a look at that when you're doing your estate planning, because that could cause you an additional probate in every state that you have those items in.
Okay. So yeah, because it's a state by state basis, you're paying for your state to figure it out. But if there's inheritance in another state, okay.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that.
Well, it's one of those things we don't like to think about it too. And I pray every time I talk to somebody that that's not an issue. I kind of hesitantly ask that question sometimes. But for instance, I talked to a gentleman this week that we got retained for, that we're having to do something in, locally here in North Carolina. He's been in California. His mother passed away there, but she had a retirement home here in North Carolina. And he's already had to do a probate proceeding in California. Now we're going to have to do one here. And I heard mention possibly of a timeshare interest in South Carolina we might be having to take care of, say in the Myrtle Beach area. So there's another 2 probate proceedings there. If you could start hearing the cha-ching, you're correct. But, so I tell people it never fails around here. Somebody will have locally, they may have a house in the North Carolina mountains. Maybe it's a vacation home, or maybe just across the state line in Virginia at Smith Mountain Lake, or heck, even at the beach or somewhere else. And, it's not that crazy of an occurrence for me to see 2 or 3 estates at once, which is, it's a lot of time, effort, and frustration that doesn't need to be there. So what I would say for a lot of people, when I talk to people about, if you have land interest in different states, certainly look at doing something called a revocable living trust. So let me pause there. And everybody thinks when I use the word trust, that trusts are kind of meant for multimillionaires, or, Hollywood, or, just people who have just come from generational wealth. And I always kind of negate that by saying, well, I think a lot of people think that because either their parents didn't talk to them about estate planning, or maybe they just didn't know. Especially in the Southeast, I find that people have estate planning documents just about as much as their parents or grandparents did, which often means they didn't, right? what I mean by that is that, it's never fails where somebody I'll be handling an estate matter now. And, we're looking back through title, and this is grandma or grandpa's farm, or great grandma or grandpa's farm. And now we're having to go back through like 3 generations of title searches and making sure that, this is done legally for title insurance and that sort of thing. So, it's one of those things that it's easier to fix now than it is to kick the can down the curb, is one of my favorite sayings, because it's just real easy to do. But having a trust is like this. There are many different types of trust out there. So for, just again, general purposes, a revocable living trust is much like a shell of yourself, right? It's just mainly for estate planning purposes to get around the court process at the end of life, and to basically transfer title a lot of times to whoever your beneficiaries are going to be. So I think of a trust as like a will kind of in a contract form, right? It's something that, if you've ever had your house painted or bought a car, or click the little icon for your Windows or Microsoft or whatever, everybody's seen a contract. But the idea is that by doing the will in a contract form, you're kind of having those same terms and conditions, if you will, dictated. But I think of the trust almost as like a bucket or a box or a piece of luggage, a backpack, briefcase, in the sense that by transferring your titles to, say, your real estate, your cash accounts, what have you, life insurance designations, basically you can pretty much anything that has title can be put into the trust name. And by doing that now during your lifetime, you're basically in essence fast forwarding through the probate process at the end of your life. So a lot of times that is one of the main ways that I tend to transfer assets that get around the court process and can help get around the probate costs and frustrations of that. But those vary state to state. What I would say is that if you're looking at trust or talking to different attorneys about trust or what have you, just make sure you know what kind you're getting, because again, there are seemingly hundreds out there. But most of the time when somebody talks about a trust as far as estate planning purposes, they're going to be talking about a revocable one, which means you get that term from, hey, you can change this, terms, conditions, you can change it, revoke it while you're alive, right? Only time you can't is when you're no longer here. So, but oftentimes I find that, for people that have estates that, especially locally here in North Carolina, I'm sure it's nationwide. I mean, just property values are growing and growing. That's one of people's larger assets, for a lot of times. And certainly you meet more people that are more land rich than others, especially. So I often tell people the more land you have, or maybe in different states that you have it in, it's going to be more advantageous for you to look at doing that. Those are really the vehicles that I see to do it. You certainly can, if you have families that have businesses or business structures like LLCs or corporations or family partnerships or whatever, you can certainly have land that's held in those. Those are usually for a little bit more complicated situations that I see. But the idea is, in essence, is that we always want to get you around probate some way or another. It just depends on kind of your goal when you're setting it up, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so if I'm hearing you right, one, there's the situation of no will. And, and if it's no will, no beneficiaries, it's intestate, right? Where that the state takes possession. If there's no will and you have, beneficiaries, then they go into probate. If you have a will, that will usually guide probate a little easier and make things happen a little easier, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've avoided the process, and it can be contested. And then trust is locking everything down for the most part, depending on what state you're in, right? Because we always have to say that because different states act different ways. But a trust for the most part is a legally binding contract. This is the way things are going to go. People can still contest trust and stuff like that, but it's just harder to do. Correct. But then there's other parts that you were talking through, like different types of deeds can offer different protections. And that's where you want to talk to your local, estate planning, specialist like yourself, to where, sort of the ins and outs of like, well, you could just do this with this kind of deed or that kind of thing. Along with that, are there other things to pay attention to? Like, what other things should somebody consider if they have sort of like a large chunk of land?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, especially, kind of coming, my law partner, Blair, does a lot of what we call our elder care aspects of law. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I tell people I know enough about it to issue spot, but, most of the time I'll recommend that, or we'll transfer that file to them. But the idea is this: elder care law, for a lot of people that don't know, is just kind of a subsection of estate planning, right? It's we're more concerned when you get to a level of, say, needing nursing home care, end of life care, those types of things. At least in North Carolina, I kind of call it the wild, wild west of the law, because we're always concerned about, forecasting what changes in the law may come. So we're kind of always looking, well, here's what we have now legally that we can do, but let's look to the future. This may change. This law may get more stringent. They may, allow this a little bit more leeway on this end. But certainly a lot of times, especially near and dear to a lot of land issues, is that, if you go into nursing home care, and at least in North Carolina, if you don't have the assets to pay for end of life care, say, skilled care, nursing home care, and you're married, well, the house is not going to be sold. The state's not going to take it out from under you while you're alive. They're certainly going to allow, you to have a place to stay. But the idea is that if the state has extended benefits on your behalf, to pay for your nursing home care, stuff of that nature, they're going to politely be asking for some of that reimbursement back, certainly if you have the means by way of land or real estate later. And it's
this is the Medicaid situation that I always hear about. And I wanted to ask you specifically about this. I'm really glad you started in on this. So this is where basically, if you end up in hospice or you end up under the care of Medicaid while you're going through end of life care, the money's got to come from somewhere. And you have a property sitting around. Property might still go to the beneficiaries, but someone's got to get paid for all that care that happened, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the major concerns I would say is, in addition to your wills, trusts, what have you, at least in North Carolina, your power of attorney during your lifetime is just as important. The way I always explain it to our clients and when I'm doing speaking engagements and stuff of that nature is that I want to have as many tools from an estate planning point of view in my tool belt as I can. Right. Because unfortunately, we've seen a lot more issues of, say, early onset dementia, or maybe just people having more issues of mental competency and stuff of that nature earlier in life. Right. And so I often tell people it's important, if you even already have a power of attorney, to make sure you're looking at what we call the gifting section of your power of attorney. And some states that might be as small as one sentence. Others, it might be as long as a page. But, for us as estate planners and elder care planners, it's really, if we have to do something while somebody's alive, but maybe incapacitated where they can't make legal decisions anymore, that power of attorney is really the only guidebook we have. And sometimes that guidebook, if it's not written the correct way, or if it doesn't have certain powers in it, we're kind of hamstrung to, well, here's what we have, and we can't really work with it. So one of the things we do, at least at our office, is that we make sure that we have what we call an enhanced power of attorney, so that if mom or dad does go to nursing home care, we can work with that son or daughter or whoever it is to safeguard that real estate, maybe doing something called a ladybird deed, doing something like a 1% deed, or doing something in order to, still legally protecting that the land, residence, whatever it is, from those costs of end of life care. And so by virtue of that, you have to protect it the right way. I often tell people I'm in a local grocery store or a church or Rotary or whatever I am, and I hear people telling stories of, oh, well, if your mom or dad's got to get on, Medicaid, you can just do this, this, or this. And I cringe because, I'm just like, oh, that's not right. Oh, that's terrible. And, but, you can't just artificially impoverish yourself is kind of the terms that a lot of people use. But there is a correct way. And I feel so bad because a lot of people don't realize that you can do these types of things. And it never fails. At least once a year, we get somebody who's come in and say, hey, we just sold mom or dad's, farm that's been in our family for 200 years. What do we do with all this money? I'm like, well, it would have been a lot easier to protect that if it was land instead of you selling it. So now we have a different issue. And it's one of those things, obviously you can't go back in time on those things. So at least in North Carolina, the way I always tell people is we have, our legislature really values real estate, and most states do, right? So I'm sure there's some ways to affect that, no matter what state you're in. Again, I would just encourage you to, if that's something that interests you, or if maybe mom or dad's getting up there in years, talk to an estate planner, but also maybe ensure that they also are familiar with elder care and that types of issues of that nature, because it's really terrible to see, families have to sell the family farm or the family land or the house that's going to be, the family vacation home for, the next century, just for that purpose. It's really sad to me. So.
And to walk through, so you used the term artificially impoverish for someone listening that doesn't know what that means, because I feel like this was part of the bad advice that comes out, right? So
for instance, I always told people I could regale you with terrible stories or horror stories all the time of things like this. Sometimes people say, "Oh, well, I can just put my son or daughter on my bank account as a joint owner, and it's not really my asset anymore, right?" Or maybe I'll just give everything to them, or I'll give everything to my neighbor or cousin or whoever it is, and my name won't be on it anymore, right? Well, unfortunately, when you go to apply for Medicaid, they're going to be asking you for at least 5 years of statements of finances and your assets, right? And if you're being truthful, and I've got some other stories I won't regale you with about that, if you don't tell them correctly, that's Medicaid fraud. But if you can't just say, "Hey, I don't have anything in my name anymore," right? No, they're going to see that you've given your children that, or you've given something, or you've transferred that deed in the wrong way, or you've done something, and they're not going to allow you to be on those benefits until at least the amount that you've given away has been, either paid down or used for your care. And so that's kind of what that means, is that you can't just artificially become destitute. You can't have nothing in your name or no money or anything. There are certain ways that certainly the end result would look like that legally, but you have to go legally by the wayside to do that. For instance, same thing with deeds. I've seen horrible situations sometimes where maybe a father will pass away, and then mother puts her two sons or whatever on to deeds to her property, and maybe they have a falling out later, right? I had a horrible situation many years ago where somebody put their son on their deed, and after her husband had passed away, and they stopped getting along, and lo and behold, son moved his girlfriend in, right? Now she can't, can't live there anymore. So she ended up living in an apartment across town, and now she's, has no really redress against that because he's a joint owner. And so I always tell people, for different reasons, you may not want to do that. I've seen people clear out their parents' bank accounts. It's always a game of, what your family dynamic is like and what that looks like for you going in the future. But a lot of times I tell people it's important to have those, and I think of estate planning documents like permission slips, right? It's what permission slip, kind of what hat are you wearing? What hat do we need to wear? Is it a healthcare power of attorney? Is it a financial power of attorney? But those documents, I want to make sure that people have, just in case, like insurance. You never hope you have to use it, but it's there if you have to, right? And I say this all the time, and I'm sure people, if you've heard me speak before, probably get tired of it. I know my paralegals always kind of roll their eyes, but one of my favorite quotes that I apply to our industry is, John F. Kennedy's quote about the time to fix the roof is not when it's raining, right? You've got to do this work beforehand, because a lot of times in the immediacy of the moment, you may not have capacity to do that. You might not be able to get an estate planner to come in over the weekend when you're in the hospital at 2 a.m., So these are the things that kind of keep you up at night, but having them beforehand is really helps us plan for the future. And especially to that elder care standpoint, we don't know what's going to happen to you. You may never go into a nursing home. God love you. That's great. But if you do, we've got options.
Yeah. And then what you're referring to is, I've had stated to me as like the 5-year window, right? Where it's like you can transfer your property into your kid's name, but if you pass with, you go into hospice care within 5 years of that, they're going to look back and be like, nah, we still need paid.
Correct.
You might think you have it taken care of, but if sometimes you're depending on the state, right? If you protected yourself past 5 years and you're fine, and things that can be possible and it can work, but it doesn't mean you're protected, because there is still a 5-year window in there where you have your fingers crossed.
Exactly. No, and I tell people that, and there are certain, being transparent as can be, that there are certain situations where, that probably has worked, right? You've been able to game the system, but again, it's like going to Vegas or betting on the stock market. It's never an assured thing, and certainly, it's control over your assets too. When I'm talking to family members or whatever about it, it's not often where people would want. It's an autonomy thing. It's an independence thing, especially for people who are getting older. They don't want to have to rely on their children as of yet. They may have an expectancy interest that, I might need your help to tag in if something happens to me. But no, I want my assets to be where they are. I want to be able to, use them as I need to. I want to be able to go on that trip, or I want to be able to, fix the roof if the insurance doesn't pay out, or, I want to be able to get a new car if I have to, or a big expense comes along. So it's always a game. But it's one of those things that, just from the overall view, you want to make sure that people understand their options going forward before it's too late, if that makes sense.
It very much does. So if you, let's kind of backtrack a little bit.
Sure.
A child going through the inheritance process.
Yeah.
This is very common with land where you've inherited a chunk of land. What are sorts of some blanket areas? Like, what do you need to do? What are the things to try to avoid? And I'm thinking back too. I wanted to ask you sort of, how to set things up with siblings, but that's really the conversation between you and your tax, or your estate planning attorney or whoever you work with. That one on how you set things up with siblings, I was going to ask about that, but I think that's more of an individual basis thing. But I guess the more relevant one would be you're inheriting lands. What are the first things that you need to do? Because a lot of people, dad, mom passes, and you have no idea what to do.
Right. No, I think that's a great question. And I often ask my, clients who, maybe I'm helping them with the probate or trust administration or something. I always tell them, like, hey, not to be the attorney in the room, but hey, have you thought about your own estate planning? Right. It's hard for me, and God love her, my wife is a therapist. And so I always kind of bring that mental health aspect in the back of my mind of, this is going to be the one time that this is going to be on your mind and it's in your face about your own mortality. So this is the time that you need to do your own planning. And so it never fails where somebody has just inherited either a lot of cash, land, what have you. And, they may have had their own assets or whatever, but for a large majority of people, you just inherited a good bit more than you had. So that's even more of a reason to plan now, right, for the future. So I often tell people, this is time to establish a trust. This is time for you to, hey, even if you have a will or trust or other documents, this is time to, let's revisit those, right? It's like getting the oil change on your car. Your estate plan is much like any other investment in your life. It's the reason you have your HVAC guy come out and, make sure that everything's running right every year. It's the reason that, you have the tune-ups to your cars and stuff. Same idea. And what I would tell people is, to your sibling comment, I will say that every year I get more and more happy that I am an only child. I'll leave it there. But, to the people that can't really control that, it's important that, I always tell people I'm not an estate litigator. I certainly see it a good bit, unfortunately. But even if you don't get along with your siblings and say you are in a position where you guys inherit land together or whatever, it's always easier to kind of get along rather than to go through maybe something like a partition proceeding, which is basically hey, judge, we're not getting along and I don't see this getting any better. So let's have a judicial forced sale. For any real estate agents and stuff out there, I always try to preach the gospel of, if you can get along to sell this property, it's going to be a lot less expensive, right? Unfortunately or fortunately, that works out sometimes. I have people that can't even sit in the same room with their siblings. That's, as you said, it's a touchy subject. But, for those of you who get along with their siblings, or maybe it's just you, And let's say it's an investment property or something, right? Well, maybe if mom and dad didn't have that protected in a certain way, maybe it's time for you to establish an LLC. Maybe it's time for you to set up some sort of business entity, because, if you have just inherited a property that's, say, a rental property, or it's going to be some other business property or something, well, chances are, if it wasn't already connected to a business entity of some sort, well, you just also inherited some liability as well for, the business or what have you. So it's important to make sure that you're checking with your insurance agent, right? Maybe it's time for you to look at an umbrella policy or something. Maybe it's time for you to up your insurance. Maybe it's time for you to, set up an LLC for that rental house. Or, gosh, I've seen people inherit, some apartment complexes, or, just a strip mall, or, something of that nature that, this is all new to you. And you need to make sure that those, as it pertains to you now, that those things are taken care of. What I would say, and I can already hear many real estate agents that may or may not be listening to this are going to applaud me or pat me on the back. Before you go sell or approach a realtor, you may want to make sure that title's clear before they get involved. Because being an ex-real estate attorney, there's nothing worse than coming hat in hand to, the owner or their agent saying, hey, I know this is supposed to close in 2 weeks, but that's not going to happen. We got to do some title resolution on this, and, deed's not clear, survey's off, something's up. Mom and dad told you they own this. Well, they only own half of it, so
right.
Make sure you own it, right?
There's those handshake deals back in the day. Like, you got to make sure that what you own is really what you own. And not just that, like, all of your conveyances are in line, right? Like, to where you've handed things down and other people don't have a piece of the pie.
It never fails that life's stranger than fiction. And when I first moved to Greensboro and bought a house, how I met my next door neighbor, sweet couple, love them to death, still some of our best friends. How I met them was I did our survey for my wife and I's house, and lo and behold, his fence line was encroaching about half a foot. So I had to go over there and be like, hey, I need you to sign this easement agreement for me. Good to meet you, by the way. So, these things happen to everybody. And it's one of those things where, in transactional law, these things do happen sometimes, right? And so oftentimes it's not the end of the world. It's very fixable, but it's, again, if you're on timelines for contract purposes or closings and stuff, obviously time is of the essence. And so it's always good to know problems before they start so you can address those. Maybe never fails. Maybe somebody has opened up an estate proceeding and they're trying to sell mom or dad's house. Well, just depending on who's involved and what the terms and conditions are of the will or whatever, you may need all of your siblings buy-in for that, right? Or in North Carolina, right? If you've inherited property and that person's, if they're married, well, their spouse is going to have to sign off on that deed. Well, you got all these different issues that come up. And again, if you don't know these things, you don't know what you don't know. So that's even more reason to talk to somebody, a real estate attorney, estate planning attorney, that can help you guide through that.
I love that you brought up the siblings getting along part, because I think that every person you can talk to has a horror story where people have inherited something, have to go through something with their siblings, and they don't get along with their siblings, and they fight so much that they do go to, like you said, they end up having a judge decide how to break things up, and that gets really expensive, or it's a long process, or they can't divest of the property, or they can't. If you're in that situation, sometimes it's best to just suck it up and decide to get along for that point in time. Otherwise, nobody wins. Right. And I think maybe with some siblings, that's the point, is I don't like how this is going, so I'm just going to blow the whole thing up for everybody. I think there are those people out there, but it just makes you a pain. No
doubt. I tell people, quite frankly, and I'm sure some of my friends who are litigators are probably going to be bashing me or calling me after this. But, one of the things I always tell people is that, I kind of came from the mediation kind of adult, alternative dispute resolution background, in the sense of most people call it hug it out. right? I just, there's no sense in spending, money for those types of things. And quite frankly, not to wax philosophical about it, but, it's not about that painting. It's not about that antique car that mom or dad wanted you to have. It's about somebody who pushed somebody in the sandbox, 40 years ago, and now they have more money to fight about it, right? It really is, and it's sad to see that sort of thing. And of course, if you're not living it, it's obviously it's frustrating and terrible for the family that's going through it. But not to make light of it, but it when you put the numbers. What you can see spent on litigation of that sort of thing, it's always easier to play ball. It just is. But that's always, it's easy for me to say that because I'm not on the other side of it.
Done. Yeah,
exactly.
You can. It's come up lately at work all the time, and it comes up all the time when I talk to people. It's like you can fix logistical problems, you cannot fix or not legal problems. I messed up my own quote, man.
That's okay.
Now, I was going to say, you can always fix logistical problems, but you can't fix people problems. People problems will always be people problems. And you can, it's just a thing where like personalities and egos and hurt feelings get involved, and they don't even have to make sense. It just is. And, it's a choice to set it aside and work together with things, because it can be very challenging, especially with land. Land can be really ugly with that.
Yeah, and you're right. It's something about land. The joke in the real estate world is always they're not making any more of it. But I think that people take that really to heart too. And that
legit,
I have, this is my family's blood, sweat, and tears, and this is the last aspects of our generational kind of history. So it's almost like that badge of honor that is even worse.
And they go through with the sale too. Like there's land sales where you have the landowner going to the prospective buyer and saying, "Well, what are you going to do with this?" It's like, well, not really your business. Someone else is buying this now. You're handing this off.
Right. And I always tell people, like, in the real estate sector, when I was doing that, like, you can condition certain things, but, they can flat out probably lie to you as well and say,
absolutely.
well, changed economic conditions. Our plan didn't work out. We're going to do this. Then we're bulldozing the thing,
Yeah.
So
like, I'm not going to bulldoze this 200-year-old house that's fallen down. No.
Right. No. But no, I mean, I think you see that, like you said, more and more nowadays with a lot of more development, just that, I don't think it's going to be a secret that, hey, your acreage is probably going to be a runway, or it's going to be a packing plant, or it's going to, whatever it's going to be. People are going to have to honor that when they put it on the market. I don't think there's going to be a historic preservation of your family's history there.
So as far as, a lot of what we talk about with inherited land or stuff like that applies to the, those who inherit it, those who are handing it off. What sort of risks are involved with people who are looking at land that they can protect themselves? Because you discussed, especially the parts of, making sure the title's good and making sure that the survey is good. What are some things to do if you're looking at land to protect yourself against a possible situation where, like, because you don't know going in that you're looking at buying a piece of land that maybe two siblings are fighting over and they haven't done proper title work.
Yeah, I used to, for a small time in Charlotte area, I used to represent some investors and investing companies, and I would always tell them, you're never going to waste money on a title search. And I used to emphasize that all the time. As a matter of fact, I would refuse to work with any kind of investors that would not want title insurance. I'm not sure why in the world you'd not want title insurance, but that always was a huge red flag to me, right? Because obviously anybody wants to make sure that whatever they're getting is insured, that it is what they're purporting for it to be, right? It's the same boundaries you're paying for. It's the same address, same whatever. I oftentimes, as much as possible, before you can get under contract, have somebody do some due diligence for you. If you're buying something, say, from a foreclosure sale, or if you're buying something, at the courthouse steps, or even just on the market, it's never a bad idea to try to get, title searches are pretty inexpensive as those things go. It might be a couple $100 or even less, but it can save you from even getting interested in a property before you fall in love with it. I feel like sometimes people get in love with land before they even have the terms, and that dictates the ride after that. But, when I was talking to investors, I would always say, be wary of that. Be wary of, and within a title search, for those people that don't know what that is, that's somebody that's going through your records of, the Register of Deeds or land clerk, whatever your state calls it, and making sure that, there's no judgments that are attached to that land, meaning that if somebody didn't pay credit card bills or whatever, those, technically that land can be sold to pay those debts, which is a concern in the estate world and just in general. But the idea would be that, that a title search probably is going to show you that maybe this person has been divorced, right? Or maybe they've had creditor issues in the past, or, tax liens, stuff of that nature. You want to make sure you have clean title, or as clean as can be, before you kind of enter into a transaction. Because, for instance, if you have a situation where there's inherited property or something that comes up, and there's, I've seen at least 50 people on a deed before. 50 heirs, I mean, obviously those are situations that, sure, if the money spends, it spends, but that's going to be a mess of a closing. So you may have to factor in more closing costs, or, I don't know any attorney real estate attorney that would do that on anything except hourly. That would just not make sense. But those things to look out for before you get into it, and always getting a survey. I used to mandate that if somebody didn't want a survey, they were going to have to sign a waiver for me for liability purposes, just because, as I told you my own story, your land survey tells you what it is. And a lot of times, if you're looking at your local GIS, your mapping systems or whatever online, the counties do as good of a job as they can with aerial stuff, but it's not going, those things are not surveys, as a matter of fact, whoever's listening to this, if you have some old maps or surveys and stuff, I encourage you to go back and see how that looks compared to GIS. It's usually way different, right? But a survey will show you what your boundary lines are, and if you're going to have any issues of people encroaching on your property, maybe you find an issue of somebody's had an easement or something on the property they have been using. Often, like you said, a handshake deal, a verbal deal, those things have to get dealt with, because at least in North Carolina, you can get into some what we call adverse possession issues. Some other states, people like to think of those as squatters' rights.
I was going to say squatters' rights. Some dude's been using your property for 20 years.
Yeah. So, and those things are, kind of what the legal term is, a cloud on title. And, your title insurance company, at least in North Carolina, I know not every state has some states have the escrow process, some don't, what have you. But the idea is that I've always used the phrase that if the title insurance company's not happy, nobody's happy. So it's not going to close unless you can acquiesce to what they're having. So those are big issues that you see from the investor or purchasing side, and then certainly obviously the typical things that you'd see too, soil testing or anything of that nature, just for whatever your purposes are, what you're going to build, those types of things. But, for definitely those people that are purchasing, making sure of what you're buying as much as you can before you get under contract. Because as you well know, once you get under contract, some money's going to have to change hands usually to get out of it for certain times.
That is terrific advice. I wanted to make sure I asked that from the buyer's side, because I think you're free and clear if you go in as a buyer. Like, you're not. You have to. You go through the process. I just got done. I kind of geek out sometimes and read some history stuff. And I just read some books that were written by Cicero, which is a guy who palled around with Julius Caesar, right? And he wrote these books when he was off in hiding. He made some people angry and he had to go off in hiding. And he wrote these books to his son. And one of them was almost completely about real estate transactions and inherited land and hiding titles and hiding defects of land when you sell it. It's like, so these have been problems for at least 2,000 years with people and trying to hand land off to other people. They're going to continue for the next 2,000 years as long as we're here.
It's funny you say that. I was reading a book and very much into the same things as that. I've been reading a lot of Stoicism and stuff like that lately. So, but I was reading an investment book. I can't remember the name of it, but there was a story and they're talking about same kind of thing in Africa in the 1990s, where a company went in and, as you might imagine, with different types of government systems and stuff there, and just chains of title not being, record keeping, that sort of thing. Two large companies were vying to buy this area for train and access and railroad access and stuff. And the larger company, remain nameless, had all the, assets in the world to kind of throw at this thing. It was their baby. They really wanted it. Kind of hired a bunch of the local attorneys or whatever in Africa to kind of figure out the title. Meanwhile, the other company just went to every 5 people that had purported to own it and purchased all of them out and saved all the money and then owned all the land too. So they said, we don't really care if there's a cloud on top. We're just going to buy everybody's cloud and make it perfect and clean that way. So I think about that a lot of way, as far as hiding titles. But yeah. So it's one of those things that, as long as land has been around, it's outlived gold, it's outlived your cash accounts, your investments. So yeah, I can only imagine that these problems have been around for centuries.
Right. Well, hey, I want to thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
I can imagine that this information is immensely helpful for most of the people that are going to listen to this. So on behalf of them, I want to let you know how much I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. I know we've gone over a little bit here as far as your daily calendar. So I want to make sure that I express my appreciation there, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, man. And I just appreciate it. It's unfortunately, it's you asked me all the questions of something I knew about. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I try to do that. This concludes episode number 32 of the National Land Realty Podcast, discussing how to protect your land inheritance with Justin Plummer from the law offices of Cheryl and David. His contact information can be found in the show notes. And if you are from North Carolina or Virginia, he is as solid as it gets for your estate planning needs. Now, you can learn more about land ownership and the buying and selling of land at nationalland.com. Okay, I'm sitting here with Justin Plummer. Justin is an estate planning specialist out of Greenville, South Carolina. I'm trying to say North Carolina. There's a lot of Carolinas out there, and I'm out west, so it's hard for me to get right. Now I get to get everything wrong because you were referred to me by someone in Greenville.
That's right. Yeah.
You're in Greensboro. There's too many.
Dog. I know, right? I know.
Okay,
Nathaniel Green didn't do any favors for us in North Carolina.
You know what? Let me start this over. I'm going to do a proper intro with Greensboro, so I don't.
You're fine, man. Hey, with a name like Justin, I can't tell you how many times it's John, Joe. It's something like that all the time. No worries.
Oh, try having Mac. It's Mac.
Right.
My father-in-law called me Max for like the first 3 years my wife and I were together.
That's great. That makes me happy. That's so.
It was his dog's name. All right.
That's hilarious.
I am sitting here with Justin Plummer out of Greensboro, North Carolina. Justin, tell me a little bit about it. And I screwed that up again. All right. All right.